Okay, I'm going to start rambling so that our next speaker doesn't actually have to be the person that rambles while people are still talking. But I invited our next speaker, who will also be, I wanted to make sure we covered our coastal world. So we've seen a lot of pictures. We've been doing a lot of talking. I think a majority of the people in here work on rivers and wetlands, but many of the same issues, all of the same issues, and actually probably a few extra issues affect our coastal resources. And so NOAA is going to share a little bit about what they're doing to date. And then on Thursday, I'll keep mentioning that Thursday session, there is a more formal presentation specifically on mitigation in the coastal zone and perspective from NOAA. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Catherine, and thank you all for sticking with us, and we'll keep going.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Catherine Shepard, and I work in the NOAA Fisheries Office of Habitat Conservation and their Habitat Protection Division. This is my first time attending this conference, so I'm excited to be here today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about NOAA's perspective with public lands. How do I do the slides?
There you go. Click the arrows might do something.
Okay, we'll see if this goes the right direction. So for NOAA, it's really important for us to be thinking about public lands. Many of our NOAA Trust resources depend on subaquatic habitats. And so typically what we're looking at is federal and state waters. So the Submerged Lands Act, it grants the coastal states a certain amount of land, subaquatic land, running along the coastline. Typically that's 3 nautical miles. In some cases it goes out to 9 nautical miles. And then the federal land goes from where the state lands ends out to the EEZ. But typically when we're talking about mitigation, we're talking about the space and the state-owned lands. We are also talking, there are also issues with jurisdiction that comes into play and what you can have private versus public. So typically you're looking at this mean high tide, and anything that falls below that is going to be state-owned lands, and anything above that is going to be possibly private-owned lands. Where there are sometimes differences, certain states may have had agreements, either pre-colonial or others, where you do get some combination of a public or privately owned subaquatic land. We also have been looking at uses of these private land or public lands, and how these public lands are being used for private purposes. So aquaculture would be an example where you have these long-term leases which allow a private entity to come in and actually use the public lands. Oil and gas leases, marinas, ports, and we're hoping that we can start seeing more banks and ILFs move into this space as well, because it's not been a space primarily used for conservation. We've been talking a lot in NOAA about some of these barriers to third-party compensation. Some of the challenges that we've been hearing are things like the leasing process, so different baselines in different states for who owns the land. Maybe there is the ability to do a long-term lease, maybe there's not. The requirement in perpetuity for protection can be a challenge, especially when you're looking at subaquatic. Public access, you can't really put fences up. So if you're looking at boating or recreational use, it's really hard to kind of protect the area. Markets is another challenge that we've heard raised, that unless there is an incentive for in-kind on site, that it makes it hard to find a market to really drive something for like seagrass or mud flats or some like that kind of mitigation, when you could just go purchase something that's going to be marsh, that's more of an upland. And we also have challenges with methodology. So it's not very well known yet how to do something like mud flat restoration, or especially if you're talking about deep sea corals, like that is mind blowing. We have no idea how to do that. but we're trying to do some research on that end. And then we're also trying to look at other ways that we can get this incentivized. We do have some examples of some subaquatic banks. So this one here is in the Portland Harbor, the Linton Mill on the Willamette River. And so primarily it is, this was a multi-use joint bank, so Clean Water Act, Endangered Species, and NERDA. And some of the credits were given for salmon, for rearing and resting habitat off channel, as well as removal of things like pilings. We also have an example of an ILF in Massachusetts that has done some restoration of seagrasses, and they've seen good success rates with this. It's limited in its use, but there are some examples out there. So NOAA's trying to do some stuff to incentivize this. We are not a land manager generally. There are some sanctuaries out there, but they're limited. We last summer had an intern, Christina Tiem. She's in the back. She'll be speaking on Thursday at this 10:30 session on public lands about a paper that she's been working on for state-owned submerged lands and mitigation on that. We've also been working on a NOAA mitigation policy, which we hope will be out soon. We released a draft of it last year, took public comment, and it's been through interagency comment. That one emphasizes this conservation that is for the best benefit of our trust resources or species, which is generally in kind and on site. And then also looking at this landscape and seascape approach, and we put in seascape in there to really emphasize that we do want to start looking at the subaquatic marine space. And we also have this summer, we're going to be looking at another, we have another intern that's going to be coming on, and we're going to be working with them to help start a project looking at barriers to in-kind compensation in subaquatic. So beyond just the state land issue, what are other barriers that are being faced in this space? So that's the NOAA perspective. Thank you. Yes.
So are you aware of the publication that is in the works by EPA headquarters? Emily French and Brian Topping?
Yes.
Okay. And they've tackled some of those questions, at least identifying some of the challenges associated with some of those intertidal, subtidal areas.
Yes, Susan Marie has been working with them, and so we're hoping to build on that paper with this, this new work that we're going to be doing this summer.
There are some in-lieu fees that are making use of things like the Forest Service's CLUA as a mechanism to provide a degree of durable protection to those subtidal compensation sites.
Okay, I'd like to learn more about that.
Sure.
How the CLUAs are being applied to that.
Yeah, in the state of Virginia right now, there's an in-lieu fee program, Living River Restoration Trust.
Okay.
And they have basically a three-party memorandum of agreement between the Commonwealth of Virginia, which owns those subtidal lands, the Corps of Engineers, and themselves governing it. And it's very similar in some ways to what was talked about with the Forest Service, with the idea that if there's a need to use those resources for some other purpose, such as, for instance, improving navigation, that they would work first to find alternative compensation before they were to undertake that effort.
Okay. Thank you. Yes, and if anybody wants to talk with me more about this or be involved in like conversations or projects, we're super interested. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, Lordy.
Do you guys even hear me? Not yet. Hello? Hi. Everything I was going to say has been covered, which is great. It's going to be fast, and we're going to get to working on the solutions or the white paper. But all I want to do quickly, because we have talked about this, if I can make it go. I'm doing the arrows wrong way. There we go, check it. So all I wanted to do was just point out within the mitigation rule that there, underneath these three categories of additionality, durability, and funding long-term management, there's nothing in there that restricts that from occurring, right? And in fact, the people who developed the rule, including Steve over there, has all the answers, have multiple options listed in there for these alternative type of mitigation opportunities, whether it's on public lands or state or other types of lands, or with cities, let's say, for a conservation easement and using a different kind of a mechanism. So there's really, under these terms, there are equivalent, if not the exact term, equivalent definitions of how you account for that. For example, additionality, we term that as the net gain of functions and services, right? That's what's credited. So I don't want to talk necessarily about the hurdles, but years ago when we started talking about this, those were the things that came up. If it's preserved, how do you give credit for mitigation? Well, you look at that difference from baseline to restored, condition. Thank you. See, I'm just losing it. And so anyway, I don't want to repeat all this stuff. You know all of this. It's allowed. Let's just put it this way. That's all I really have to say at this point, that the Corps does not restrict you from doing it. But it has been said multiple times that they're supposedly leading it. Now, unless there's a specific guidance in a district that specifically says that you can't, then I would, as a past consultant, push for those options, right? And you should be able to do that. Let's see if there's really nothing else. That's it. Like, after all of these fabulous people, I was like, Lindsay, I don't need to cover this. We've talked about it. I did want to do one more thing. So while Jeremy was talking, I realized that my colleague Valerie Lane, who manages all of our ribbits and ribbits data and is wonderful and doing all these workshops right now, if you have a chance to go to them today or tomorrow, she pulled, about a year ago, when she got involved in this conversation, she realized there was no way within ribbits at that point to easily track what mitigation was currently done on public lands. So she had our contractors upgrade ribbits and add a little checkbox for public lands. And anytime that data is modified, then you can't save it until you check that box. And if you do, then there's other options of whether it's state, city, etc., land. So it's wonderful. So that in the last year, we're starting to be able to collect that data. And so far, there are 145 mitigation sites, third-party mitigation sites, right? Because that's all ribbits tracks. 145 sites that have at least been opened and updated. 21 of those are pending, right? So those have got to be fairly new, although I'm sure some bankers would argue that they could be years old. There are 75 approved and 141 or so sold out, right? Many of those, I would say the lion's share of those, are in the Wilmington district and are on state lands, and mostly for stream mitigation credits, and completed by, Steve probably knows this off the top of his head. Wilmington Department of Environmental Quality, and they have a Department of Mitigation that does this for, to provide cost-effective mitigation alternatives to, for state lands, which I thought was really kind of cool. So I need to dive in more into that program and see if they are commercial, if you will, and sell those credits. And then one other topic that came up was dam removal and crediting dam removal, and how do you do that? I just want to point out that in 2018, the Corps put out Regal 1801 that outlines how districts can credit dam removal, and looks and specifically says that any functions that are directly related to that removal. So not just the dam, but also, fish passage, water quality improvement, sediment transport, etc. So I think there are a lot of tools out there that up until now we've been talking about hurdles, and we haven't necessarily been pointing out all of those tools that we have to solve these problems, and that's where we're headed now. So I don't know, go forward and do mitigation on public lands. That's what I got. Yes.
Michelle, introduce yourself.
Oh gosh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's my first
I've
question.
been sitting up here for a while, like having a hot flash. I'm Michelle Matson. I work for the Corps Institute for Water Resources. About 5 years or so, I came out from California to work with Steve in Virginia, and then he just retired, but he's here with us. So I'm an ecologist. My training was primarily in restoration and wetland stream ecology, and I did that for, 13, 14 years as a consultant, and then in LA District as a regulator, and for 5 years or so, and now here at the Institute. And I work on other programs too, which are really cool. Sustainable Rivers program for civil works and operations. You got to look into that, bankers. Yeah.
Thank you. I
Yeah.
have a question.
Yes.
About core policy in terms of allowing mitigation banks, private mitigation banks, or public-private partnership mitigation banks to be done on property for which the Corps has indicated that there is a plan. I'll give you an example. Many, many years ago, like 1995, South Florida Water Management District put out an RFP for 3 wetlands mitigation banks on lands that they, I guess, owned or controlled to the private sector. And one of them was called the Everglades Buffer Strip, which was between a U.S. highway and the Everglades. And it was desperate need of restoration. That eventually got pulled. The other 2 banks went forward. But that one got pulled because the Corps said, we have a plan for those lands. They had no funding, none. They had no design of the restoration plan, but they had a plan somewhere. And is there an actual Corps policy that, because I'm sure they have a lot of thoughts about a lot of lands and so on and so forth, but it struck me as strange at the time.
Yeah.
Eventually they got out there to eradicate some of the exotic species. It only took them 25 years, okay, and they, had to pay for that themselves, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Rather than have the private sector do it to help them.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, is there a Corps policy?
Okay, so now you're talking about civil works, right? And not regulatory. And later, I think on Thursday, I'll be talking about public-private partnerships with the Corps and civil works and the different hurdles that they have, and those were actual legal hurdles, at least under the interpretation of some attorneys, and maybe not others. But I'm not an expert at civil works policy. I would guess no, but that, they're always looking for projects to put forward for funding, right, in the planning division and et cetera. So I doubt it's a policy, but what do I know? I'm finding all kinds of new policies now working with civil works recently. If I can find it, I will let you know.
But the premise of the question is that it seems like if there's a project that is planned for, the Corps won't want to provide credit for that plan because it's going to happen anyway, right?
It's going to happen anyway, and the idea is, why should we enter into an agreement with you or allow you to go do that?
And so then the question is like,
So-
how far along in the planning process must it be to nullify it? If it's a conceptual plan without funding, or
Just a question. I don't know if anybody else in the room knows about this so-called policy, but it struck me as bizarre.
That is bizarre, and I think, I mean, you know, with Civil Works needing more mitigation sites and opportunities and whatnot, my guess, if it wasn't funded, it probably just was on the shelf for a while. Steve shook his head too, no, and so I trust that he probably knows.
So this is sort of a general question for the panel about public lands and its use for mitigation. So in Florida, under protected species, the state has a robust gopher tortoise protection program. A lot of private sector work and mitigation banks for that. So with the advent of the solar explosion in the state, they swept in and took in all the available credits, and the private sector had no place to go. Like, a lot of projects came to a grinding halt. There was a bit of a lift where the solar, because they were FERC, were able to move it over to Eglin Air Force Base. Therefore, there wasn't any competition. They were just moving them off the rolls. But we still had a problem with price gouging, if you will. Typically, it was about $950 to $1,400 per tortoise to relocate it to a bank. The going right now is $6,000. And so all of our developers are saying, can't you just go put them in the forest? We have all this public land. Can't you throw them out over there? I'm like, well, it doesn't quite work that way, but it's a good question. But then the private sector is like, well, if the state enters this market and the state's competing against the private sector, are they going to lower the price, or will they enter it at the same price that it's at right now? And so does anybody have a clue about the pricing conversation if the government enters it, and can they compete against private? The world. It's okay.
The Corps wouldn't. The Corps wouldn't.
Well, I mean, I think that's Steve's got his hand up. Why don't we start with Steve? Go to Steve.
I would suggest that you talk to Greg DeYoung or maybe John Wigginton. They have a commercial private sector gopher tortoise bank. It's Mississippi, isn't it? It is Mississippi. Yeah, Chickasee. And their experience dealing with the state of Alabama and equivalency of compensation. I think that's one big issue, is that mitigation on public lands should be held to equivalent standards, and that's one of the problems. Rigorous prescribed fire is necessary to maintain habitat for gopher tortoises, and what they were finding was that the state was not managing the lands to the same level. And so they couldn't compete.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
One thing to that, if I can.
Yeah.
Florida actually has in its statute, its enabling act for mitigation banks, a requirement of equivalency. And it applies to everything except for the financial assurances, which they don't require the state to put up. So we were very concerned about that issue early on in the process for wetlands mitigation banking. I don't know that it applies to species.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Yes.
I'm like, I don't know what button to talk to. I was just going to say that I think a lot of the comments we're talking to here apply across almost every conversation. So, there's the complexity of like supply and demand, and, conceptually each bank sets its own price based on what's happening in the market. But I know there's been quite a lot of concern about this potential for undermining, which is, I think, why Nate was talking about kind of land value and the various ways that, at minimum, we would like to encourage anytime uses are happening on public land that there's appropriate compensation, whether it's dollars, whether it's alternative services like trails and or facilities, even land swaps. We have a project where it's actually a permitting responsible project, but the mitigation that the permitting responsible entity is using 15 acres, they actually had to provide 15 acres of public lands, 15 acres of private lands to the public entity to basically go into public lands. It was not it was not restored land. It was in another, lower in the watershed, but there was a literal land exchange in addition to other services. So I think that that's definitely a topic that's going to be part of not just this white paper, but warrants just conversation in general. And I think, Steve, your point about, in general, I think every business, there's a whole spectrum of, ethics, and everybody should be held to the same standard, and whether it's public or private, but within private and within public, I have a tendency to do, I don't want to say too much. I have a tendency to do what I think is needed, and sometimes I've looked at what other banks are doing nearby, and I'm like, I'm never going to get a job again, because I'm suggesting they need to do a lot more to be able to manage this in perpetuity. And so I've had conversations with the resource agencies about, how do I, with a straight face, tell my client that they should be doing XYZ monitoring, adaptive management, your funding needs to do, be this to cover it, when you've approved a bank, even if it was in the last decade, for a tenth of the endowment. And so I don't think we're going to solve that today, but it's a reality that I think warrants a whole other session, probably. But with that, we are going to hand this. Oh, Devlin, yeah, go. Yeah. Yep, go.
Okay, so, I don't know if I'm on or not, but, yeah. So, there are people in the room who know a lot more about this than me, but on the biology side, specifically to the tortoise question, I want to point out that equivalency is really important because you get what you pay for. And I don't know about the price range for that, but if these tortoises have a social structure, if you just bus them over to another location and drop them off, it is not going to be successful. So, they need to be pinned up for a year, supplied with food, everything they need to become acclimated socially to their new environment and all that, and that is expensive. So you get what you pay for. We want equivalency. Just be really careful before you make those decisions. And talk to the tortoise experts.
With respect to the competition, I wonder how a state or other public entity would have the funding to set up a bank and compete with the private sector. We see them a lot. I mean, what they primarily do is set up mitigation for themselves, right? But but they're single user banks, right? Because they have the funding for their compensatory mitigation, and that saves them money in the long term. But, for sale, I don't know how they would justify spending that money. Have you seen that, Maris?
No, she's actually going to come up here, but thank you. So with that in mind, I want to go back to what we were talking about in the very beginning 2.5 hours ago, and that we have a lot of different entities in the room using banks and banking in a variety of ways. And so our next two speakers are actually kind of coming from a different perspective. And what I want to do is encourage the room to kind of listen and look for those common themes, because as we were just talking about, we kind of all have the same problem. So if somebody solves it for their situation, conceptually, it's an opportunity for us to apply that to another situation, whether it's a traditional banker or a land manager or a water agency. We're all trying to kind of solve the same thing. So up next is a partnership or a duo. So Maris is going to come up and join us, and then Jennifer Shook should hopefully be able to speak. And Maris, you're controlling the PowerPoint. Yes, you're Vanna.
Vanna White for the first couple of slides.
And will you guys actually introduce yourselves first, since I failed to do that?
Jennifer, are you on?
Jennifer?
There you are.
Hear me okay?
We sure can.
All right, great. Thank you. Well, I'm Jennifer Shook. I'm with OC Public Works. I wanted to share our perspective as a local landowner, land manager, and someone who implements mitigation. And if we could pull up the presentation so I can see it, hopefully. Great. Thank you. Next slide, please. So the County of Orange, we're a coastal county in Southern California. We are the third most populous county in this state with a population of 3.2 million people. We do not have any mitigation banks within the county boundaries. As you can see on that green vision map on the right side, we've got Sokol Mitigation Bank, which is just outside of our county boundary. And we're in the primary and secondary service area through parts of our county through that mitigation bank. And then there is San Luis Rey Mitigation Bank in San Diego County, just on the other side of Camp Pendleton. And we're within the tertiary service area in South Orange County there. And the Friends of Harbor Beaches and Parks put together this great slide to show just all the conservation lands we have in our county. So all the green lands are current conservation lands. Some are federal with Forest Service lands. Some are county owned. Quite a few are actually county owned in our park system. And then we've got some private conservation lands. And then anything that's identified as orange parcels, those are the potential conservation lands. So as you can see, there's very little opportunity to add additional conservation lands outside of what's already publicly and privately held. Next slide, please.
Wrong way.
And then on this map, as you can see on the left figure, it's the northern part of our county is primarily developed. That's the gray area, and green is undeveloped and orange is agriculture. So North County's very well developed, a lot of hardened infrastructure, hardened flood control channels. It's got a huge groundwater basin that is used for groundwater recharge and drinking water for our county, at least North County. South County tends to be more mountainous, more hilly, and a little less developed. And the County of Orange itself owns over 60,000 acres of parks, wildland areas, open space areas. We've got over 220 miles of natural water courses. That might be natural earthen channels, engineered earthen channels, and riprap lined channels. We've got 11 watersheds, and as the county, we own the largest area of land, and that also gives us the most opportunity to do mitigation on our own land. But due to the lack of mitigation banks in our county, we also are approached by third parties to do mitigation. And I forgot to add earlier, we also have two special area management plans in our county, Natural Communities Conservation Plan in Central and Coastal Orange County, and then a Habitat Conservation Plan that covers South Orange County. Next slide, please. So about 5-6 years ago, the County of Orange, the different agencies within our county formed a mitigation task force, and that I represent OC Public Works on that mitigation task force, and we have representatives from OC Parks and OC Waste and Recycling. We recognize the need that we need to work together. We're three separate agencies, although we're all still under that county umbrella, and so there was a need for us to find consistency within our own organization to approach compensatory mitigation. As the Public Works agency, we tend to have more of the impacts implementing our capital improvement and maintenance improvement projects. And then Parks tends to have most of the open space, so we look to them to do our mitigation, and Waste and Recycling does have some mitigation need for implementing their landfill services. And so about 3 years ago, the county retained the services of ICF to help us come up with some sort of strategy. So what we wanted was a long-term strategy to plan out our mitigation years in advance. When we do our capital improvement projects, we actually try to look out 20 years in advance. And so we wanted this comprehensive program to make sure that our needs were being met as a county, so we could understand what our needs will be and project them and then match them with available opportunities on our land. We also wanted regulatory certainty. So as we're working through our projects, we want to be able to know that the game's not going to change. Sometimes, we do CEQA, California Environmental Quality Act, very similar to NEPA. These can take a couple of years to go through that process. And as we're trying to plan the mitigation, we want to make sure that we have the same program and a consistent program moving forward. So we're looking for that regulatory certainty to not have the game change partway through. And then we also wanted to be able to identify a sustainable funding source. Oftentimes, if there's third-party mitigation, I'll cover it in just a moment, but they'll pay us some money, but not enough. Or even, funding our own projects, we have to make sure that that remains a line item on our, it's appropriated annually with our budget. We were also looking to streamline project approvals, similar to that regulatory certainty. We just wanted to be able to build that trust with our regulators, and our program is now managed by ecologists and biologists, and we all want the same thing. We all care about the environment and are very passionate about what we do. So we just want to be able to agree on some really good projects for the environment and then be able to streamline those project approvals. And so as we're going through the permitting process and CEQA and our budget process, that we know what to expect. And then we also wanted a program to improve biological outcomes. We have found through some of our older mitigation projects that we did a lot of what we call postage stamp size mitigation, and they're just very small sites that were really subjected to a lot of external pressure from non-native seed source, drought, fire. So we would love to be able to integrate the goals of our special area management plan, the natural communities conservation plan, the habitat conservation plan, and prioritize on a regional scale and look at landscape scale restoration. So rather than doing these little tiny mitigation sites, we could perhaps do larger mitigation sites and that are more durable for the long term to help us deal with some of the stressors like drought and wildfire. And then we also wanted to integrate with our long-term management program. We've got a lot of current existing mitigation, permanently responsible mitigation, so we're looking to how to fold that into a program with what we'll need in the future. So we just wanted to have this comprehensive plan to capture all of that and figure out, how best to move forward with that. Next slide, please. In the past, as I stated, most of our mitigation is on parks land, and it used to be that the mitigator would work with the regulatory agencies, conduct the mitigation, or pick a site on parklands. Our park staff weren't very involved in selecting these sites. It would put an encumbrance on the parkland. The work could be done in pre-mitigation rule. They got their sign off and they walk away, and then this land gets back into being managed by OC Parks. Oftentimes they weren't well mapped, so they got lost over the years, and so now we're trying to make sure we understand where all these encumbrances on the land are. So it's trying to catch people before they retire and piece together some of that institutional history that we know of. And then presently now with the mitigation rule, it's helping bring some of that consistency to know what to expect moving forward. And we also are still trying to, now a lot of our permanently responsible mitigation sites are moving into that, perpetual management phase, the long-term management phase. And we're recognizing as we're going through some of these projects that there's a lot of different performance criteria, there's different monitoring needs, there's different maintenance needs, different funding sources, different site protection instruments. And so we really wanted to have this program to capture all of that, again, just to give us something, to know what to expect in the future. So as, current staff moves on and transitions, that there's that solid program in place to, handle this program moving forward. And that way also when these programs, or if there's third-party mitigation on county land, that we know that it's coming with an appropriate funding source, that we are well aware of what those performance criteria would be as we take on those obligations. And as we've developed our mitigation program, we call it OC Comprehensive Advanced Mitigation Program, OC CAMP. I'm going to turn it over to Maris in just a second. So we've been going through all of our options and understanding the benefits, pros and cons of each option and weighing through those. So I will turn it over to Maris, who's going to discuss the barriers that we've discovered in trying to implement this long-term comprehensive program and some solutions that we've come up with to work through them.
Great, thank you, Jennifer. And something that we haven't mentioned thus far is what we are doing with OCAMP. What is OCAMP? We worked with the regulatory agencies. We've had a number of kind of regulatory lightning workshops where we've evaluated the numerous compensatory mitigation mechanisms to us. Ultimately, we arrived at developing an umbrella mitigation bank. This umbrella mitigation bank would be kind of the first in Southern California, and it would be the first with a local agency as the sponsor. So as we've worked through this program and really started to develop this program, we've identified a number of barriers or hurdles, a lot of which you've heard about today, a lot of which are not unique to a sponsor or to a private banker. So just here, we're going to list a few. Umbrella mitigation banking, not common for our local regulators in Southern California. They know that it exists, but we also have, because we're in Southern California, more than just the Army Corps as our bank IRT member. We have California Department of Fish and Wildlife. We have the State Water Resources Control Board, who is our 401 entity. Within OCAMP, we have 3 regional water quality control boards, all with 401 authority, participating in our IRT. We have the California Coastal Commission, we have the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and we have NOAA Fisheries interested in our program. So with that number of agencies and agency representatives, we clearly have a lot of agency requirements, differences in opinions, as well as different regulatory mechanisms, many of which do not recognize umbrella mitigation banks. With Orange County being a public entity, of course an in lieu fee program would have been appropriate. Of course, it's the easy mechanism that we would pursue. But our California Department of Fish and Wildlife, who is a required member, we need them to buy into this program. They don't recognize in lieu fee programs. They have no regulatory authority to approve an in lieu fee program. We also recognize site protection mechanisms, and the required or preferred site protection mechanism for the agencies is a conservation easement. That's not necessarily the required or the preferred mechanism for Orange County, so we're working through that. You know, a lot of the other common themes that you've heard about today are, you know, county-owned lands are already protected. How do we ensure and demonstrate to the agencies that we're not double dipping with this program? And also, again, funding. The county, as a public entity, and something that Michelle just mentioned is, the county doesn't have a large bucket of money to pay into and to develop OCAMP. They don't have that amount of funding to put up a financial assurance, to fund an endowment up front. They are funded on an annual basis through their appropriation process. So what are we doing to overcome this? We're meeting with the regulatory agencies. We've met with them a number of times. We brought them to the table. We're basically forcing the issue and forcing them to work with us. We've prepared a prospectus. We've identified the issues, the challenges, the hurdles. We're identifying solutions and basically digging into their regulations and identifying why what we are proposing is acceptable. We're basically developing white papers specific to our program to, again, just help the agencies check that box and to demonstrate that a restrictive covenant basically meets the needs of California Department of Fish and Wildlife's conservation easement requirement. We're writing and documenting why their funding, our program's funding mechanism is appropriate based on the regulatory limitations or the regulatory requirements across all of our agencies. Let's see, we're also heavily relying on our California Banking and In lieu Fee Program Agency MOU, which basically is all of our local agencies committing to identifying and working through solutions, right? We all know that when we bring something new to the agencies, the gut reaction is, whoa, I can't do that, right? We've all been there. So we're heavily relying on their commitment to work with us and to identify solutions for this program. Let's see. Oh, another item that we're pushing is broadening our service area. Again, you saw that slide that Jennifer presented showing how built out certain areas within our Orange County service area or the plan area, how built out they are. We're needing to justify broadening our typical service areas. And in doing so, we are really working through not only the county's needs, but entities needing compensatory mitigation outside of the county, and really utilizing the county's lands and to prioritize the most ecologically beneficial mitigation opportunities throughout the numerous watersheds within the county. And with that, that covers our Orange OCAMP program. If you all have amazing ideas and thoughts about how we can overcome some of these hurdles, I would love, and I'm sure Jennifer would love, to hear some examples of solutions or real world examples that we can point to so that we can bring that to our agencies. And again, if like Jeremy said, if we can show them that it can be done, a lot of times they will agree it can be done.
I do want to point out really quickly that Maris used to be a regulator, and so have I, and we used to say no a lot as well. I had many applicants say, "Why do you start with no, Michelle?" And I'd be like, "Because we can only get better from there." So it is, you know, so I don't want to offend, I don't want any of us to offend
Yeah.
any of the regulators in the world. You have a really, really hard job. Hence why now I'm at the Institute for Water Resources, right? I can just talk about this stuff and not have to like battle the applicants, because it's so hard to balance what you have to do and all the regulations and guidance and everything that you have to follow and reduce all the risk. So just FYI, like we're looking for solutions, but maintaining the quality of the compensatory mitigation. I just felt like I had, thank you. I didn't want the core regulators to
I'm a core regulator at heart, believe me. I miss my core team. I will be back one day, so just say that.
I'm Don Ross. I've never regulated anyone. Never been a regulator. But I do represent a CDFW mitigation bank. So I've gone through the CDFW mitigation permitting program. And it sounds to me, I understand it pretty well. What you have said is that you're looking for a non-equivalent bank. You're looking to not do what everyone else would have to do under the CDFW protocol, which is pretty rigid. You're looking to not endow the bank. Or you said they couldn't afford the endowment, or for some reason they don't want to endow it, and on and on. So, I mean, it's like, this is one of the issues I have. I mean, you know, we're talking about mitigation on public land, but this is the public mitigating on their land, public land, with different rules. Or asking for different rules, or let's just say flexibility. Flexibility that isn't offered anyone else. So this is, from a private sector standpoint, this makes me want to run away, you know, because government has preferences and should in many arenas, but we've opened the arena of mitigation up to the private sector, and we're holding their feet to the fire. And yet, when government comes in, they want to, the fire's a little hot. We can't do that.
So what I will speak to is, yes, we are looking for flexibility as it relates to how it is funded and when it is funded. The county recognizes, and the agencies have told us, that we are not going to get around funding an endowment that meets the long-term management needs of the proposed compensatory mitigation. So it is not necessarily seeking to eliminate that requirement, but seeking flexibility on how we get to that same end product. And then also kind of recognizing that the county owns all the lands. They are not only looking to support their own mitigation needs, but they are looking to support mitigation needs outside of the county. And when you look at Orange County, there's not a lot of land available for private entities to get their foot in the door and to also develop compensatory mitigation opportunities. And so it's the county's way of looking at their own needs, but then also offering up outside mitigation opportunities. And like I said, it is looking for flexibility, but recognizing that ultimately they're going to get to the same end requirement. They're still required to do an endowment. They're still required to fund it as if it were a private bank. But how we get there is going to be a little different.
But they could just get a private bank. They could just get a private bank and partner with the bank.
And they might.
And we can definitely talk about this offline, because there are additional hurdles that we didn't necessarily have the opportunity to get into today, or the time to get into today.
But I think those partnerships would be key
Absolutely.
to scaling this up.
And this is more of a question, Maris, but do you think the flexibility that is being asked for is because of some of the constraints on the county themselves, you know, how their budgets are done, and so it's not so much flexibility because they don't want to do something, but they in and of themselves are constrained?
Absolutely. There's a lot of
I can respond to this one.
Please, please do, Jennifer.
As a county agency, and especially with flood control district, I represent the flood control district as well through Public Works. We are tax-based funded, and so just trying to be good stewards of our taxpayers. And as Mary said earlier, we do our budgets, much like the state agency, we are appropriated on an annual basis. And for one of my smaller sites, that was 1 acre in size, to set up a non-wasting endowment to cover the annual cost, it was going to be about $2.5 million. So if you extrapolate that over all of our project needs and the size of our projects, we're talking probably tens of millions of dollars if we had to fund a non-wasting endowment. So as Maris noted, we're looking to trying to seek that flexibility in hopes that we can build up the endowment. So rather than having to set up a non-wasting endowment up front, we would like to actually be able to build up with it. So we could program it into our annual budget, get it appropriated annually, and then also be able to ideally prioritize some of those funds on the different sites. So if we have a really dry year, we may not have a lot of weed growth. So there may not be as much weeding needed at one site, but then we might have another part of our county that got hit by fire. So just trying to explore some of that flexibility so we can actually put our tax dollars to the best use and address, see sustainable outcomes and invest that money in projects that are sustainable while still, meeting our needs, compensatory mitigation. We are a public works agency and we have to abide by the Flood Control Act and provide safety projects for, protection of public, life and safety in roads. And so we're trying to find that balance of, we have to meet our obligations as a municipal agency. We're doing our compensatory mitigation, and so we're trying to find, okay, where does that, where can we find the flexibility to fund these programs, and so we can implement all of that and make it all work successfully in the long run.
My name is Doug Lashley. I sat in the back and listened to this, and I'm going to be as polite as I can. I developed my first mitigation bank 28 years ago, and you never stop learning. And how's that? Is that better? Mitigation banking is a very, very complicated business, and I don't think the government should be involved beyond its regulatory obligations that at the federal level are clear, at the state level are fairly clear, within the agencies, municipalities, counties, it's pretty clear what they have the authority to do. I had trouble telling from the slides whether the county intends to sponsor, develop, construct, maintain, and monitor in perpetuity, and provide financial assurances that what they're doing, even on public land, is going to work. I know there's others in this room, including a former gentleman sitting back here who helped guide this business the last 30 years, and I can't imagine that anybody would think that the government should own and operate a bank. The easiest thing to do is to draft a very, very thorough RFP and invite the private sector to develop the bank, and if it's a bank for the sole use of the county, and for the impacts that the county has to mitigate for, and wants to do it on public land, write the RFP to provide for that, and put the risk and the time and the effort on the private sector. Half the states in this country have in lieu fee programs that don't work properly. All they're doing is collecting money, putting it in escrow, and writing RFPs to have mitigation done. And a lot of them have been shut down. And to operate a mitigation bank, you're dealing with income tax, real estate tax, adjoining property uses, regulatory constraints, and that's before you even get to the science of the site, and finance, insurance, bonds, long-term maintenance, and perpetuity. I just think you're going down the wrong road, but that's my opinion, but I had to say it. Thank you.
Well,
Isn't or is, right?
what was that?
I said, I don't know that it is or isn't right now. It's more
Yeah, right now it's just developing the mechanism. It is very possible that when the county is ready to develop and implement sites that it could go out for RFP. But what I can speak to also is that the county over decades has been basically doing what you said. They are responsible for their permittee responsible mitigation for themselves on their land. They have been abiding by the regulatory requirements, you know, and more recently in accordance with the 2008 mitigation rule, where they are identifying, developing, implementing, moving it into long-term maintenance and monitoring and management for individual sites. And so this is basically, and really what the intent is with the mechanism, is to get consistency for all of their mitigation sites, primarily to serve themselves, but it would be opened up to third parties. But it's really to generate that consistency, because we have regulatory changes, we have regulator turnover, and therefore to get, you know, as Jennifer said, eliminate the surprises and get the consistency for the program in which they are already operating on an individual site by individual site basis.
So I had a question just real quick. Why not public-private partnership? In Northern Virginia, I think I could probably think of Prince William County that did it. And I believe the village of Herndon did it as well. So your model is already out there. Yeah. But I agree, all the funding, all the money, I saw Five Rivers Metro Park in Ohio try to fund their own bank, and they had to get tax bases to do it. And they did a bank. It was all right, but it's a little stagnant. But the public-private partnership that Angler did, who's now Res, with Prince William Parks, and that WSSI did with Herndon, who's now Davy, you know, they were models that worked, and their plans could be followed.
Mm-hmm. We haven't ruled out public-private partnership. We're still pretty early in the exploratory phase. Going down this path to see if this is something that works. It's not a done deal by any means, and one reason we, you know, like to present at this conference and get that feedback. So we've definitely had that thought of public-private partnership and have not ruled it out at this time.
Hi, this is Nate Bello from WRA. I entitled and manage the Soquel Canyon Mitigation Bank, and our service area covers most of Orange County, and the bank is actually partially in Orange County. And I'd like to reiterate what folks are saying here about public-private partnership. The private capital who've invested in that mitigation bank, if they knew that there was strong demand from Orange County Public Works and a strong need, they would put money in the watershed in a heartbeat, whichever watershed you needed the mitigation. And the risk would be all on them, not on the taxpayers.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Heather.
Yeah. Well, and Maris is here all week, and Jennifer is very accessible, and I know they're both really eager to continue these conversations. And I don't know how many folks have been in Orange County, but it is a large, dense, populous portion of Southern California, and so these are really big decisions for the county to make. And so what Maris and I believe Jennifer are sharing is really the initial concepts that they're working through internally, because you can't go out to talk about a public-private partnership until you know that this is the path you're going to go down at all. And so I think that what's being shared here are these initial visions and concepts, and asking this group for input on what that might look like. So with that, we're going to move into another scenario also occurring in Southern California, and I think that there are some themes here, and I'm going to say that's because of the density of development, the need, and the limited private lands. So Heather Dyer is going to give us an amazing presentation on the Upper St. Anna.
Thank you. Okay, I think I'm last up, right? So everyone's dying to leave after this conversation. So we're kind of quirky. I will say, I think I'm one of the most rare specimens in this room. I am also a former regulator former endangered fisheries biologist with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that is now the general manager of a water district in California. So not a common transition for sure. But what we found is that kind of the complexities of trying to solve for endangered species issues apply very well to water conflict, to solving permitting issues, to try to bring the equation together and get to this, holistic solution that we all want. So I'm going to talk about the Upper Santa Ana River Habitat Conservation Plan, and not necessarily about mitigation banking. I will admit, we've gone from we're going to do a bank, we're going to do an in-lieu fee program, no, we're going to do a bank, now we're going to do permitting responsible. We've spent 8 years going in a gigantic circle. So I don't know what the right solution is in terms of banking, but I will tell you about our challenges of how we kind of arrived here. So first off is about 2014, 11 water agencies in Southern California realized that they were never going to get permits for their water projects unless they worked together to develop a conservation strategy that could adequately offset the impacts of water supply projects in the Santa Ana River watershed. So this looks like, how do you take water out of the wastewater treatment plants that provide the only water during the summer to an endangered fish species, so that you can then use it as recycled water and put it in for groundwater recharge? Both of those needs are valid, right? We had to recognize that. We want recycled water for the long-term sustainability of our water supply. The fish need water. So it took us quite a long time to get through, I think it's like the 5 stages, denial, anger, bargaining, whatever they all are. But it took us a while to get there. But we finally landed on the fact that we all have to work together to solve this problem of people need water and fish need water. We have an endangered fish in our system. We have, a highly engineered system that is not natural in function in most areas of our river. How do we basically get habitat, endangered species, water supply projects, all with taxpayer dollars that we can defend to our constituents? So we started working on the Habitat Conservation Plan in 2014. We have our draft out and it's going through the approval process right now, but it has been a long process. I would also mention that we were not just fighting with the regulators. We were also fighting with each other. We were trying to sue each other over whose project would be the first and only one to get a permit for this endangered fish species. We were fighting with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service all the way to the Supreme Court. Lost that, so that kind of brought it all back into focus. Like, okay, well, maybe we need to be part of the solution. This HCP team has grown. It started as 5 agencies willing to work together, and now we're at 11, plus Southern California Edison, because our conservation strategy to meet the needs of primarily just a few species, which are the highest risk, Santa Ana sucker, which is a fish, and the San Bernardino kangaroo rat, which is a small mammal that is dependent upon alluvial floodplain function. So we started working together. We realized that the conservation strategy was going to take everything in the recovery plan for the Santa Ana sucker: stream restoration, captive breeding and translocation, all kinds of basically restoration all over the watershed, aquatic organism passage, all of those things. We had to do it all in order to basically get the species to the place where some take could be permitted for our water supply projects. So then that brought in Southern California Edison, which just added another layer of complexity because we wanted to translocate an endangered fish into streams where they have operations. And of course, they were not very excited about that idea. But we have been working with them, and we're also getting them an incidental take permit for Santa Ana sucker in parallel with our own permit. So we solved that problem, and we ended up at 12 agencies trying to work together. This actually came in really handy because what we figured out was that we needed everybody's resources to be on the table to kind of solve this large puzzle. Some agencies had land, some agencies had water, some agencies had money. And so we put it all on the table and said, okay, well, we need fish, we need water for fish. Hopefully my pointer will work. So the fish are all located in this area of Riverside because the wastewater treatment plants release water about right here. So there's no fish habitat above upstream. Luckily, this is where we want to put all our water projects. So these are stormwater capture projects, recycled water projects that we take wastewater and we put it into basins for groundwater recharge. And so we're concentrating our restoration efforts and our mitigation efforts from here downstream. We're building our projects up here. Up in the forest, on the San Bernardino National Forest up here is where we need to do translocation with captively bred fish. So it was a whole watershed effort. And what we ended up at is that we have 50 years worth of projects, which you can imagine when we first started planning, we didn't even think we could get one project permitted, much less 50 projects permitted, water supply projects, operations, and maintenance over the next, 100 projects over 50 years. So it was very daunting. But we were able to figure it out by phasing it in. We've made a commitment of get ahead and stay ahead. So all of our mitigation will go in ahead of the impact occurring. So this has been quite complicated in figuring out, not only are we working on our endangered species take permit through this habitat conservation plan, but we're also permitting all the restoration that we're doing for these species at the same time. Just so you know, the types of covered activities we have are wells, pipelines, stormwater capture, recycled water, like I said, but it's a whole watershed effort in terms of all of the different infrastructure that needs to work together so we can have this resilient water supply. These are some of our species. Like I said, the driver was Santa Ana sucker, which is a fish, and the San Bernardino kangaroo rat, but we also have endangered plants, we have endangered birds, and I think it's something like 21 species or so is what we landed on throughout the watershed. And so our conservation strategy was really the driver behind what are all the things we're going to commit to in terms of our mitigation and how are we going to actually implement it. Valid point from the gentleman. We're a special district. We have a small staff. We have 3 environmental experts and a bunch of engineers. But, this is a really large task that we're undertaking in terms of restoration, long-term management, and monitoring. But it came down to we had to protect the existing habitat that we still have, which is not much, and it's in terrible, terrible condition. Urban streams reliant upon, urban drool as its water source in many circumstances. We had to reduce the threats. We have, the usual suspects of aquatic predators. We have a ton of homeless encampments that build these huge check dams, and they build large encampments, and they actually fish for our endangered fish, if you can believe it. So we have a lot of threats, invasive weeds, all those different kinds of things, water diversions. So we needed to reduce those threats. We needed to create more habitat where we could, which I wish I would have put a picture of one of our urban streams because it's really, really depressing. Any of you that have been out there to the urban streams of the Riverside area, they're ditches. They're highly impacted by urban runoff, a lot of flood issues, and a lot of homeless encampments. But we knew that that's what we had to do because the problem is that we couldn't create more habitat in the river. We needed to create more habitat adjacent to the river so that the fish could get out of the main channel, breed, feed, and get out of storm events. And so this was the 4 components that we started working on in terms of, okay, how are we going to actually be able to offset these impacts? And what does that look like over 50 years? So these are just 4 of our stream restoration projects. Like I said, they're all mostly in the city of Riverside. And this is the place where we first ran into one of the biggest obstacles to this, which was the places where we needed to do restoration, especially for the fish species, but also for our alluvial fan-dependent species like the kangaroo rat and some plants. That land is in a floodplain, or it is in basically a flood channel. And so that is owned by either a flood control district or a local public agency. That land is in the ownership of public agencies. How do we possibly start to mitigate on that land? But there really was no other option. There's maybe, I would say, 10% of the land within our system is actually owned by a private entity that, you might possibly be able to purchase it. So then we started talking to each of these agencies, and luckily many of them were in our habitat conservation plan. So that's where this kind of all resources on the table comes in. many of our partner agencies working on this plan, they had land in the places that we needed to do restoration, or they could put water in the places that we needed water for these fish. And so we started this kind of bargaining process where, okay, if you put water out in this creek right here, Lower Hole Creek is what it's called, it relies on basically urban runoff. It's not sustainable in most years. It's got a lot of pollution involved. So we started coming up with ideas of, okay, can you somehow put recycled water from this wastewater treatment plant into this creek to sustain flow in perpetuity so that we can make basically a reliable fish stream? And then how do the other 10 partners make that up to you? And so we started talking about, okay, well, I can't put water in this stream because I'm 20 miles upstream, but I can put water above your municipal wells. So we started doing these trades. And in the end, what we landed on is basically when everybody kind of takes their jurisdictional boundaries out of it and what they can't do, what you start looking at is just how do you place the resources, whatever they might be, in the places that they are needed, and how does everyone else compensate that party for doing so? So we had that happen multiple times, especially related to specific habitat land, again, owned by public agencies. So we had to do these trades. They were not allowed to do what they call gift of public funds. I think I hear that phrase like 4 times every week. We can't do this because of gift of public funds. Okay, well, can I compensate you in a different way? And so we started trading out land where maybe there's no suitable habitat, but someone could put solar panels on it. So one of our partner agencies will put solar panels on a bare piece of land that one of our other partners owns. They let us have some of the habitat land for the kangaroo rat that we put into conservation, and it kind of all works out in the end in terms of the restoration and the conservation part of it. So we're restoring these 4 streams. The costs are skyrocketing. Our biologist, our program manager is here, and she tells me, I think every week, oh my gosh, the price for this creek has gone up, by 100% and all these different kinds of things. But honestly, it is what it is. And when you compare it to the value of the water that we are permitting projects for, it really starts to make a lot of sense for us to do this. This is another one of our activities. This is fully within kind of I would say the main stem of the Santa Ana River, but outside of core levees. So we're thinking, all right, well, we're going to create stream habitat down in the riverside area. The fish, what is the span of the fish habitat? And they were very separated. There was about probably 8 miles between where the fish are now and where our restoration activities are. But we knew that they would move back and forth. It's just they need some rest areas. So it's kind of, I explain it like if you've ever driven through West Texas and you leave, San Antonio, and you're like, okay, well, where's the next place that I can get gas and go to the restroom? So that's what we're creating here, is kind of some rest stops for the fish in this very, channelized part of the river. It's a lot of sand. You can see this right here is all sand. And it turns out all we have to do is put some structure in the river, create a little more velocity of the water. It'll uncover the gravel that we know is down there and expose these little rest stops along the way so that the fish can go back and forth within the river. And we haven't created technically more habitat, but we have made more habitat available and connected for the fish and effectively expanded their area of occupation within the river. Translocation to the upper watershed. This was so controversial, but like I said, it had to be done. There was no possible way that this fish species could recover without having additional populations in the upper watershed outside of the areas of basically the urban center. So this is the area where all the impacts and risk are to the fish. This little black area right here, that's the wastewater treatment plant that supplies 90% of the water to the fish habitat downstream. This is where the refugia habitat is for the fish. And so we wrote a translocation plan. We did all these habitat assessments to make sure that these mountain streams are suitable and appropriate habitat for this fish. What's happened over time is that they've just become disconnected from flood events and then drought. the I-10 freeway right here. Those kinds of anthropogenic activities have disconnected them from their historic range. And so what we're proposing is that we breed more fish, put them up here, create self-sustaining populations over time. And so while they'll never, ever be connected, we don't expect that fish will ever move from here to here and vice versa. But there will be probably 5 or 6 populations of fish up in this upper watershed that are self-sustaining. We hope 5 at any given time. We realize there's risks associated with wildfire and sediment flow and all those kinds of things. This is a very stochastic system. But if we, have enough populations that any 1 or 2 might be kind of, I would say, out of commission at any given time, but the rest of them are still going, then we have a more sustainable population towards recovery of the fish. And again, this is all coming out of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Recovery Plan. We basically just started implementing as many of the things in there as possible. The alluvial fan was a really big challenge, because we have, so this is a major dam, Seven Oaks Dam. Santa Ana River headwaters is behind it. No fish go through here either direction. This is a water operation facility right here, a huge borrow pit that was used to construct the dam. These are some of our recharge basins that we use to put water in our groundwater basin. We have a huge mining operation. And if that wasn't enough, this entire span is all San Bernardino County flood control. So trying to figure out how can we adequately offset the impacts of this species, or these many species, with these very significant constraints in terms of who owns the land and what needs to be done. And so again, we started kind of with this bartering system of, okay, well, I can't just go over to, like, let's say, one of these upland areas and start restoring if there's no animals out there. They're not connected anymore. They don't have a way to get up into the upland refugia. So we started looking at, okay, what does the science tell us of where we should be restoring habitat? And how do we bring that together using basically all of the different elements that we have available and all of the different partners that we have available? Which brings me to my most significant challenge, which I still have not solved. It comes down to whoever asks the question of, what if they say they have a project? Oh, we can't do anything on that land because we're going to do something with it someday. And what we found is that, so the flood control district, they need to get their own permits, and they want to use their land for that, mitigation. I'm all for it. Great. The only problem has been like 25 years working on a permit. So basically nothing is happening, and the land is degrading, and the species is, worse and worse off over the years. And so we've started to just try to find ways that we can work together and say, okay, we really need to do restoration for this species in this particular area that's on your land. Do I have land that I can trade you? Like someone was talking about earlier. Can we do a land swap? Can basically we still use your land? I pay for the uplift and we split the credit. What is fair and what is reasonable? They're a public agency. We use taxpayer dollars as well. So we don't want to do anything that is a disservice to the taxpayers that we serve. But at the same time, they need permits, we need permits, and the species are in these very small, discrete areas. So that's been a big challenge, and we still haven't solved it, but we made a lot of progress that way. But in the end, we were able to pick up, quite a bit of land. I work with a great a housing development partner who gets leads on land that's occupied by endangered species that I can then purchase. So it's kind of based on those partnerships and relationships in figuring out, like, how can I access that resource that I really need, and then how can I make up for that with whoever I'm working with, whether it's a developer or flood control, or one of the other agencies. So this comes to your point, sir. We are doing an endowment. We have figured out how much that endowment needs to be. These are water supply projects. So when you compare that to the cost of the water, basically what is our avoided cost by doing this, it makes sense for us to do a huge endowment, because water, so we will be permitting about 80,000 acre feet per year. In, I guess, a comparison is for this year for the State Water Project, we spent $66 million for our share of the State Water Project. We got 5,000 acre feet. So 80,000 acre feet more water from a local source that we can depend on is really important for us. If we can't get it locally, we have to spend between $1,000 and $2,000 per acre foot. So there's a lot of basically economic value in us developing our own local water supply. But we will be doing an endowment, a non-wasting endowment. We are committing to long-term management and monitoring. One of my secret superpowers is recruiting former regulators to come work for me. So I have someone from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I've hired someone from Cal Fish and Wildlife. I hired someone from the Corps of Engineers. I used to work for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, so I've got these great brains working on, okay, how are we going to manage all of this land? We have funded county rangers to patrol these lands because we found that it's cheaper for us to pay for their positions than to keep restoring habitat over and over and over again. So we've just kind of worked our way through all of the challenges, solutions, and they keep coming, but we keep, pretty much finding ways to deal with it. I will say that one of the only reasons that we're able to do this, one is the value of the water. About $1 billion worth of water will be permitted through this plan. But the other one is the 11 partnering agencies. No one agency could have ever done this on their own. It took the power of the collective in order for us to move forward and be able to achieve this, which includes monitoring, management, and endowment. So why are we doing this? Increased regional local water supply. The fact is we cannot count on deliveries from Northern California in any given year. We need to have our own local supply. The value of that water, of local cost savings, almost $1 billion for these agencies. We're permanently conserving about 2,000 acres. We're agreeing to manage it in perpetuity. We see that as an additional benefit to our taxpayers, though. So this is not something that's like a burden. It's something that we feel we're using taxpayer dollars, we're buying land, or we already own land. It's part of that stewardship ethic that's bringing, forth additional values to the public by us doing that. Protecting 12 endangered species, 22 native species. We've estimated, about 85 new jobs annually through all of these different water projects that we're building. And like I said, 80,000 acre feet permitted locally through this plan. And the most important part of that is this makes us resistant or resilient, hopefully resistant to some of the effects of climate change. So again, we're trying to diversify our water portfolio, diversify all of our conservation areas, make sure that we can withstand the coming pressures or the pressures that are already here so that we can have this resilient, long-standing water supply and community. Thank you. Questions?
It seems admirable to try to save this river, but it's almost like it's almost like trying to save the last 1 acre of a wetland in an industrial park. Have you thought about using like the mitigation approach and spending these resources and efforts somewhere else, or are these species endemic to the river?
A lot of them are only found in the Santa Ana River, although it is highly degraded, I'm not going to lie. It's kind of depressing in certain areas. But there's other areas, and even though, I'm a biologist, so I became a biologist to save the wild salmon. And, like this very romantic idea of what it means to be an endangered species biologist. And then I got to Southern California and I went out there on the first day, and it was like a completely dry riverbed. And I actually thought that I came from Lafayette, Louisiana, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, where there's more water than they know what to do with. And I went back to the office and I was like, are you messing with me right now? Because I'm a fish biologist. There was no water in that river. So it turns out that I had to broaden my view of what is important in terms of the natural ecosystem and the ecosystem services that it provides. And although it is not, the American River or, any of the beautiful rivers that we want to be working on, The comparative, a realistic comparator to the Santa Ana River as it is now, is the Los Angeles River, which is completely concrete lined, trapezoidal channel. They're spending something like $30 million to restore 1 mile of that river. Take out concrete, try to get some bushes to grow again. So then I go back to the Santa Ana River and I think to myself, okay, it's not pretty. It's got wastewater as its major flow. But if the Santa Ana sucker cannot survive in this system, then we've completely broken it beyond all repair. But we haven't. They're very resilient. They still hang on. And what I like about the Santa Ana River is it's still accessible to the people that live along this, very urban corridor. Kids can still go out there. They can catch a frog. They can catch a fish. They can hear birds. And so it's about more than just kind of my romantic idea of what a beautiful river should be. It's more like, okay, is this an opportunity for the next generation to get out into nature and understand that there is something to be appreciated? And so that's why I'm trying to save this river. And I get what you're saying. I gave this presentation once to I got an MBA and I did a business analytics class and I did my statistics on the Santa Ana sucker population. And my professor said the same thing, like, why are you trying to save this? Couldn't you just, go somewhere else? But I refuse to accept that because I feel that there's an intrinsic value to saving some portion of a wild river, even in this highly urbanized area. And so my goal is to make it better for those kids and the future generations. And I practice something called fierce resolve. And I just every day think to myself, like, in 10 years, it's going to be beautiful and there will be a sustainable, reliable water supply and there will be fish and it will always be engineered. It's, never going to be the Cedar River in Washington State where I grew up, but it does offer value to the communities of this region. So.
Well, I'm a little nervous. Usually I'm not, but I'm going to say nice things.
Okay.
So, these are two great programs. So I work for a company called Vulcan Materials, and we have got a 2,000-acre bank just north of you guys.
Yes.
We're doing great. You guys are still going through your process. We've written letters saying we want everything to be at parity. But really, this is like the national highway system. When they get this in, 5 million people are going to move into Southern California. And they're going to have habitat impacts that are going to be great. And there's so many opportunities. And also, you guys are creating big opportunities, RFPs for restoration. I mean, there's so much money that's coming into our community. So you can resist this, but long term, this is going to create mitigation and infrastructure needs that they're not going to meet. You're only doing it for public agencies at this point.
Correct.
And so with 5 million people moving in, the habitat demands are going to just go through the roof. So I applaud what you guys are doing. I think that's going to do so much for the industry as well, and will do great. And then within the development community, there's so much need coming our way. So this could be totally uneconomic. If you came to me and said, I'd like you to bid on delivering 500 acres of KRAD habitat 47 years from now, because that's the it's just not going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So it would be nice if some of the small pieces could come out to the group as a whole. But I think this should create a great opportunity. Marilyn, you're well with the Riverside Habitat Conservation Plan, and San Diego has a civil habitat conservation plan. They're trying to get ahead of their overall needs because of all this influx that's coming through. But within those programs, that's U.S. Fish and Wildlife and Cal Fish and Wildlife, there are huge Army Corps opportunities. And both of those habitat conservation plans say we've got no maintenance, we've got no uplift. Please bring projects in and improve our banks even more. So if you don't understand Southern California and the long-term planning, you guys look like competition, but you aren't competition. You're really enabling our industry over the long term. That's why I'm nervous saying this in front of all you. I actually like their programs. So anyway.
Thank you. Thank you.
So as a segue to the gentleman from Vulcan, I'm curious from a technical perspective on the sediment transport that's being basically coming from the headwaters that's most likely being captured behind the dam. You showed some structures that would increase, some of the finer sediment flushing through to allow for some of the gravel materials to be exposed. But really, I'm concerned or more curious as to, are there any sedimentation plans shy of working a deal with Vulcan to redistribute some more natural sediments through the system? Is that a concern, especially in some of those deltaic regions that may or may not be providing natural sediment flushes or pulses that you would expect to support that habitat?
Yeah, so we did a lot of modeling of the sediment transports. Coarse gravel and cobble is a requirement for Santa Ana sucker, not just for spawning, but also for feeding. They actually scrape algae off of those cobbles. So we did a lot of modeling. About 20% of the natural flow and also the sediment transport is now trapped behind the Seven Oaks Dam. We still do have quite a lot of unimpaired flow, but we do propose some of our projects. I think there's 16 different small stormwater capture projects that would basically capture not the peak, we let the peak go by, but kind of the tail end of storm events. So we modeled, what does that mean to the sediment transport over time to the downstream habitat? And so there will be some impacts. And so we have come up with mitigation measures that's in the plan. So basically, not just letting all of those coarse gravels get buried. We would put them aside and then kind of redeposit them downstream because we do want to let the peaks go by. We don't want the highly turbid water anyway. So we're kind of figuring out how can we strategically, again, engineer the system so that those coarse gravels don't get taken out of the system permanently. But they just get kind of engaged with the next storm event and continue to move downstream. But it was a really challenging modeling exercises in terms of what are the impacts of storm flow capture. Base flow, you can just, model depth, width, suitable habitat. But storm flow, it's like, okay, which ones are we actually going to capture? What is the velocity needed to move that sediment in the first place? So it was quite complex. I do still have my eye on sediment behind Seven Oaks Dam. I think I saw someone from the Corps here earlier who was on a national sediment team that I would love to trap in the hallway and talk to you. But sediment transport, because of dams, is a huge issue in our river. We have 10 feet of sand and 6 inches of coarse gravel that we need to figure out how to get exposed. All right, thank you so much. It was a joy.
Okay, so I lied again, and basically part 2 became part 1. But with that being said, if you guys could share my screen one last time, there's 2 emails that'll be put up on the screen. One's mine, one's Jeremy's. Oh, snap, maybe I'm not sharing. No, I said snap.
I'm not convinced you said that. And I think if you could turn mic 2 on, I don't know if you can do that.
Gosh, I'm having issues. Just shout, Jeremy, how do I share?
It's the magic button. Oh. So I would also, Lindsay's going to put up our email addresses. Part 2 really was seeking your input on what this white paper should include in order to help us move forward with this effort of mitigation on public lands. Because, again, it's happening, and there are ways to do it better, and there are shortcomings to how it's been done thus far. And as has been addressed and raised a few different times, public-private partnerships might be the solution to some of the challenges in some contexts. And so hearing from some of you who are big advocates of mitigation on public lands would be great. Hearing from those of you who are really reluctant and resistant to the idea is actually fairly critical to make this white paper effective, because you can help us identify what those points of contention are and what framework needs to look like for you or your company to participate in that kind of program. Because that, if we acknowledge, as I do, that a public-private partnership is really important in this context, it would be helpful to kind of illuminate and describe what that must look like for it to be effective on your end.
Yes. Thank you, Jeremy. So both my email and Jeremy's email is up there. Jeremy's going to double check and make sure his email's spelled right.
Looks good.
Looks good. And we would love to, hear from you directly. We would love to include you on the stakeholder group. We're all here all week, and it's a topic we are passionate about. And once again, I'm just going to reiterate that I think that this group can play a really significant role in a lot of ways, not just for banking and not just for continuing your own business, but also for some major issues facing us as a society. And actually, I think Heather's presentation really illustrates that the dollars that are required to make this project happen on public land are significant. This is not a project that would ever go in front of a for-profit banker and say like, hey, look at this crazy 50-year 20-something species, hundreds of acres of mitigation on multiple property owners. Like, there's no way that passes the test of, being a viable investment. That being said, when Heather solves problems for her project, it solves problems for the same projects that may make sense for mitigation on public lands for bankers and vice versa. So although there may be scenarios where public-private partnerships are the best, and actually I'm hoping there's lots of those scenarios, there are going to be some scenarios where it just doesn't make sense, but that doesn't mean that we're not still kind of all in the boat together, and that the bigger kind of objectives that come out of this will kind of help us all, both as an industry, as practitioners, and as a human population. So with that being said, it's 5:00. It's been a long Monday. I'm super excited to hang out with you guys the rest of this week. We will be around, and thanks for sticking out with us. The fact that there's so many of you still sitting here is amazing. So, and thank you to all the people who participated. I think that was like 10 different people that we had talk, and thank you to the AV guys in the back who
Thanks, AV guys.
who did all this crazy finagling. So thank you again, everyone, and have a good night.